Hello and welcome to another episode of Skin Like a Rhino, the podcast by LV, in which I, Tania, get to meet some incredible women who are breaking old taboos and new ground. Today's guest is no exception. We have best-selling author Lucy Jones, whose latest book, Matrescence, is forcing us all to question what it is to become a parent. Matrescence is a term which is a bit like adolescence, so it covers a developmental stage and talks about how as women we go through not just physical changes, social, emotional and psychological changes, and that this is a particularly vulnerable period we need to be able to understand better. Really enjoyed the conversation with Lucy. We'll be talking about everything from what is the meaning of matrescence, how is it useful as a framework to understand parenthood, and also a lot about the historical and societal expectations on women in terms of becoming intensive parenting or the perfect mother and so on, and what are some of those taboos that we mean to smash. Welcome, Lucy. It's so great to have you on the show.
And can I just say it's such an honour to be talking to you, and I'm just in awe of how much you've helped so many women and what you've done for women's health. And yeah, it's a real privilege to be here chatting with you.
Oh, and I think particularly it's just great because I think you and I are quite, even though we don't really know each other at all, but I think we've gone on quite similar journeys, I can tell, even in terms of our lives, in the sense of I think we were both one thing before we became mothers and then went through that journey and ended up in not just in a very different place as women, but also in terms of what we then decided to do. So obviously I started LV based on the sense that there was just no focus on me as a woman and the physical changes that were happening to me. And I think that's kind of what I picked up as similar that what happened to you. But I'd love to hear it from you yourself. Like, you know, how did you come about to write the book Matrescence, and what was it in your own journey that kind of made that happen?
So, yeah, I became a mother in 2016. And I'm a journalist, I'm an author, and I'd kind of worked in like mainstream media in my 20s. I worked at the Daily Telegraph and I worked at NME. I was a music journalist for a bit, and then I kind of moved more into science and health writing, and was writing freelance for all sorts of people like the BBC and so on. And I had a kind of an upbringing in the 80s, 90s, noughties in feminism, and I guess in a kind of, privileged middle class home, quite a lot of conservative ideas. Basically, I grew up knowing absolutely nothing about motherhood or about the maternal body or about pregnancy or birth or early parenthood and the experience for the woman or birthing person.
Apart from probably the expectation that we would always one day have two children.
Right, exactly. The expectation that it would happen. Of course, it would have to happen. And it would be the kind of icing on the cake. It would be like the grand fulfillment, the kind of the experience that would fulfill me as a woman. And, I really wanted to have kids. I was really happy to be pregnant and have my daughter. But I just found the experience of pregnancy, birth, and early motherhood so dramatic and so seismic and big in comparison to how I felt it was being depicted. So, what did I know? I thought that my body was like a box or a pot and the baby would kind of grow in it. And then when she was born, I would just go back to myself. And my midwife said 9 months on, 9 months off about the baby weight. And, I'd very much absorbed this kind of bounce back culture. At 9 months, I would need to go back to work or earlier and kind of hide my children, hide my motherhood, hide the psychological, emotional, physical scars of childbirth, which remain with me. And I guess I found the metamorphosis both incredibly shocking and kind of dark at some points, almost violent in the way that I felt women and mothers were being so neglected in so many different ways. but also really interesting. I did a degree in English Lit, and have read. I'm like a voracious bookworm. Read widely and been privileged to be educated and well. And yet I've never read really a passage about birth, or particularly from a mother's point of view, or maternal subjectivity. So this kind of explosion in my life just meant that I had to make sense of it, and I make sense of things through writing about them. So that's why I started to write the book.
But you talk about, also as part of the way you make sense, obviously it sounds like you read a lot too, right? And I was the same, as in I became a mother and I just thought I'll read some books, it'll tell me what to do and how to have this happy, contented baby. And I just sort of thought if I just followed these rules, then everything would be fine. And then realized, I was literally looking back, I had a sort of four-week-old baby that I was trying to make it sleep at certain times. And it was so stress inducing, right? And I think when you talk about the depictions, I mean, if we just sort of go into that a bit, like what are the depictions of motherhood? Is it sort of this rosy tinted sort of sentimental view that becoming a mother is just this joyous occasion, right? Which it is, but I think what you're saying is all the other stuff too, right, that we don't talk about.
Exactly. So I think the way motherhood is depicted and has been culturally and in society, what I picked up was this kind of pastel-hued dream of mother being always able to soothe and do the right thing. The maternal instinct idea. I thought that when I became a mother, I'd know what to do, and it would be, scare quotes, natural. That a mother could always soothe her child. I'd grown up with like icons of like Mary and Jesus in our house. It was a very religious upbringing, and Mary always looked so chill and like totally blissed out, and the baby Jesus was never crying or having a tantrum. And I came into it, I'd never changed a nappy. I'd held like a couple of friends' newborns, but and I was just like you. I thought, because to solve problems in the past, I'd always read and research. So I was in this kind of frenzied, frenetic state of trying to read everything I could about trying to make the baby sleep or feed. I had really big problems with breastfeeding. And it has taken part of my matrescence has been like a real like reckoning and acceptance that actually that way of knowing, that knowledge creation, which is essentially quite post patriarchal, post enlightenment, it doesn't work. Like I had to realize that actually like the idea of a natural instinct isn't very true. Like it's a kind of confected idea that is put on women. It serves to like prop up this idea of intensive motherhood when actually, caregiving and parenting. I mean, I'm pretty early on. I'm like, my eldest is nearly 8, but it seems to me that it's a skill that can be learned by all people. And the maternal brain and the parental brain research, which is coming out, is really clear that we all, people of mothers, fathers, people of all genders, have the neural circuitry to learn how to care for an infant. So it kind of disrupted this like very basic naive notion I had of what a mother is.
But is there are they slightly separate issues in that the intensive parenting, which is this sort of cultural phenomenon, which seems to be almost fairly recent, right? If you talk to our parents' generation, they seem to have been much more laissez-faire with parenting, right? So maybe come to that in a minute. But then in terms of the natural instincts, I'm actually surprised you said that in some ways, because I think you talk a lot about in your book, and also based on your earlier books, about the ecological perspective, right? And actually that we are increasingly divorced from nature, right? So if we look at parallels between how humans bring up their babies versus other animals, there is a lot of natural instinct in there, right? Or do you mean something, is it the natural instinct of what's expected now with parenting? As in, do you not think if we went back thousands of years, it was also a learned skill, or how was it different when we were more tuned with nature than the sort of constructed societal norms that we're all trying to deal with?
So I think that, we see a culturally imagined and confected idea of a, scare quotes, natural maternal instinct, which which suggests that, the baby is born and handed to the mother, and she will know what to do, and she will be able to instinctively, naturally know how to care for this baby. And I think that's been inflated in order to, as a kind of proxy for wider societal care, and even, bringing in partners and so on. It puts a lot of the burden on the individual mother. I take quite a lot of my cue here from people like Sarah Blaffer Hrdy. She wrote this book called Mother Nature, and it was really it was so interesting because actually, this is the ultimate taboo to talk about, I guess, but infanticide is very natural. Like, there's, in our kind of evolutionary history, it doesn't, it isn't as simple as like a woman gives birth and she immediately feels that bond. Actually, that's, like, if you look at our history, it's not like that. And of course, we know that we evolved in these small collective caregiving networks. And a recent research from this guy called Nikhil Chowdhury, I don't know if you've come across him, at the University of Cambridge. He's an evolutionary anthropologist. And him and his team have been studying hunter-gatherer groups today. And they found that a new baby, an infant, will be responded to by between 10 and 20 people in a day. And a mother will respond about 40% of the time. And so they conclude that this suggests that in our evolutionary history, we had very many more caregivers, allo mothers, allo parents, which is, it's so different to today, where we have, essentially an individual woman, usually, obviously, sometimes it's a father, in a house, caring for a child.
But even if we look, if we look at in our modern history, right, even a couple of 100 years ago, the grandparents would be much more involved. Or if you look at other societies, my father lives in Thailand, there, the grandparents often look after the child for the first couple of years, right? You're absolutely right. It's kind of, obviously with urbanization and so on, so this sort of pressure, you think, increasingly on the woman. How has the father's role changed in this then, would you say?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because fathers are spending a lot more time with their children than they were, in the 1950s or so. So I think a statistic suggests that mothers spend twice as much time as women did with their children than in the 1950s. And men today spend about the same amount of time as women did in the 1950s. So we're still seeing this disparity in time and caregiving. But, my dad never changed a nappy, wasn't in the room when we were born, which was very normal in the 80s. I've got an amazing husband and co-partner who is present, and that is, that's obviously culturally happening more. Men being able to take part in the toils and the rewards of caregiving. However, we don't have enough social support for that. So paternity leave is very low. There's not enough social support for new dads or dads who are primary caregivers. We know that, of course, fathers get postnatal depression and so on. So while we're seeing this, fathers doing more, it needs to improve a lot more as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned about brain changes, right? And I know in Matrescence you talk about the changes that happen at a neurological level for women, which I knew about, but what I didn't know about also, I think, is you talk about changes in the carer's brain.
Yeah, so I became really interested in this area of science because when my daughter was born, I had a really kind of destabilizing sense that my brain was really different, and I hadn't expected it. I don't mean, the actual, what we know now as baby brain. Of course, there was some short-term memory verbal lapses. I was extremely tired, but it was different. It felt like my attention had changed, how I was kind of gathering information. It was really hard to articulate, but I had a sense that my brain was really different through pregnancy, birth, and early motherhood. And I was super fortunate that the year my baby was born was also the year that the first really landmark study was published by Elseline Huxma and her wider team, which showed that pregnancy renders pronounced and significant and long-term changes in the brain. So it was the first time the human pregnant brain had been studied, and the effects of pregnancy on the brain were so significant that in the images you could tell exactly which brains had been pregnant. So they compared two different groups of women. And in the last 6-7 years, many neuroscientists, a kind of matriarchy of, and some men, neuroscientists in many labs across the world are building on this research. And so they found that the impact of pregnancy is comparable to that of adolescence. So it's changing the brain in multiple areas. And the idea, the theory is, which makes all sense, is that the brain is being fine-tuned in order to be able to look after a baby and respond, all the massive skills that it takes to raise a baby. So this brain science is really, really interesting and helpful, because it also underlines the fact that when a brain is plastic, like it is in adolescence, it's also vulnerable. So it could hopefully lead to more treatments for postnatal mental illness. It will hopefully lead to a kind of, we're living in a world where, our paradigm is very scientific. We need data and evidence to tell us things that maybe instinctively we already know, which is that new mothers need support and care a lot more than they're getting in our society. But I think I'm excited about that brain science, particularly about new mothers or birthing people, because you can't really argue with it. It really shows that this is a vulnerable stage, like a neglected, forgotten transition, where the brain can be vulnerable, and then with all the different social factors that lead to severe stress, such as poverty, systemic racism, domestic abuse, a child with significant health needs, those can then create a more of a problem and vulnerability. But like you say, there's also concurrently this research which shows that the father's brain anatomy changes shape, and with affectionate hands-on care, the caregiver brain changes. I mean, this won't be news to anyone who's an adoptive parent or a non-gestational mother or a father who's a hands-on dad. But now we know that the brain is also in those early years with that intensive hands-on care. The baby is changing the brain of the caregiver. Sarah Blaffer Hardy argues in her book that a primary caregiver father, the brain will change just as much as it would a mother who's been pregnant and given birth.
Which you'd expect, right, from an evolutionary point of view.
Right. I mean, maternal mortality, this culture of alloparenting.
Is just a question I've had for myself is like, have they shown in the literature whether or not it affects kind of sense of risk and risk taking? And because I feel like I've just become so much more cautious, like constantly worrying about accidents happening and bad things happening in a way where I felt like I was way more carefree before having a baby. And like, have I become like that? But I can also imagine it's an evolutionary thing. Like I can see that even though it stresses me out and a lot of it's unnecessary, I can also see from an evolutionary point of view why it would be important for survival, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel exactly the same. I used to always we'd sometimes go on holiday to the south of France, and I always wanted to do what's it called, kite surfing or parasailing. I never did it, but I always wanted to do this crazy risk-taking stuff, and my mum would never ever do it. She'd just be like, no way. And now I can see I'm exactly the same. We watched a film the other night about, it was so good, it was called Under Paris. It was about sharks in the Seine, and I was like, oh my god, I will never do deep sea diving. That's not happening. And I haven't ever done it, but no way. I'm not putting myself in any situation where, because I guess it's so existential being a parent, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because I know you do talk about, I mean, obviously the book's in the title is the word metamorphosis, and I've heard you talk about how existential philosophy also helps you to kind of understand things. And yes, instinctively, I can say I felt like it was an existential issue. I didn't know who I was, but I don't know how. I love you to talk me through how existential philosophy can help provide more context and meaning to this metamorphosis that we go through.
Yeah. So I found this area a bit late, like maybe a few years into my matrescence. I'm not sure matrescence ever ends. I don't know, like, how old are your kids? Are 10? Your kids?
Well, I was going to ask you that as well.
Yeah.
10 and 13.
Oh, wow. I mean, you'll know better than me.
Yeah.
Does it ever end? I feel like maybe it just changes.
I think with my 13-year-old, I'm feeling nostalgic. I can see that he is so independent. He's very mature. He's always been a very sort of, I don't know, more on that side. So I can feel him moving away from me more and more. And I can see that at some point, not too far off, my role as a mother will, I think it will end. Maybe I'll be more of a friend, I hope. Yeah. But maybe you always, obviously you still care and you still worry. I'm not sure. You have to ask me in a few years.
Yeah.
Do you mean matrescence in terms of, obviously we're always mothers, or do you mean the physical changes or there's always change, but there's always change in everything in life,
well, that's
right?
it, isn't it? I suppose, in the context of being a mother, a father, a parent,
what
they need or what you need is always changing. I think the existential stuff I found really useful, and this is really led by an amazing psychotherapist called Claire Arnold Baker. So she edited the first ever textbook for existential psychotherapy around the perinatal period. And I found this just unlocked so much for me in terms of, primarily seeing that the work of early motherhood and early parenthood is literally keeping something alive. So that's quite a big deal. Like it is it's an existential experience. It's about survival. It's about life and death. But then also with that, for me, a lot of my angst in those early years was like, I could not get my head around the notion of like time and mortality, and that I hopefully I will. It's really hard to talk about your children's lives, isn't it? Life and death. It's almost you don't want to, and it's interesting that I'm struggling to talk about it. The existential experience of like your child's life. They will die at some point. You will die at some point. Life is fragile, and that kind of existential experience of being confronted with that, I don't think I'd ever considered like my mortality in the same way. Been lucky to not have been ill or in my life, but also things like choice. So Claire on a
but just to say on that one, Lucy, I completely, because my mum died when I was a kid, right? And then when I became a mum, it brought up crazy access. I literally was like, can I even be a mother and all this sort of stuff? But also, you're right, you then worry about it. I was like, what if I die, or what if my husband dies? And what we've been through, even though I've been through it and I survived it, somehow it just started terrorizing me, this idea, right?
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. It is, in that sense, it is very existential, right? But then you also have to somehow not let it be that you're worrying every day. My kids have started walking on the streets by themselves. I'm like, oh my God, they're going to get run over, and you just can't. You have to almost park it, don't you?
Yeah. It's like the everyday terror of like my kid's got a really bad splinter at the moment we were talking before, and his foot's really red, and we got the doctor in a few hours, but of course my head goes to sepsis, and I'm Googling these, because that's just what you do. That's how you look after children. And you have to kind of, quieten that everyday terror every day, because you don't want them to see, that much more about the world than they do. And there's all these frights around the corner and so on. But there's also choice in the existential thinking. And I Claire Arnold Baker, I interviewed her for my book, and she talks about how, in motherhood, everything has to be chosen again. Kind of it throws everything up like a kind of deck of cards. And, especially if you've taken a little bit of a break out of work or so on, I feel like it changes everything, existentially, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, economically. Your time changes, your values change it. Everything has to be chosen again, which is such a kind of existential.
But yet we don't really talk about those choices, do we? In the sense of we're just expected to have the baby, have our mat leave, and then go back exactly to whatever we were doing before. And these are well thought rights that we have to go back to our jobs and have the same job and so on, right? Thanks so much for listening. You're halfway through. Don't forget to follow Skin Like a Rhino so you hear about new episodes. And please give us a star rating. It helps other people to discover us. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
Well, it was something that really took me by surprise, was a sense that, I had like 9 months statutory leave, but I had to work through that time. So I wrote like a piece at like 3 months. And so I was doing a little bit of, you're allowed to do like 10 days of work or something with the self-employed thing. And it was too low anyway for me to not work. But in that time, I was really like startled by how, although I knew that, my care and protection of our child, because I was the primary carer at that point, was very serious and very important. I had to get it right. But I also had the sense that this kind of baby care, this infant care, was not productive in the real sense. It wasn't real work. It wasn't something to be proud of in the real world. In that kind of work world, I would kind of have to hide it. It was seen as a bit like queasy making. What are you doing? What do you do with your baby at home? It's hard to even articulate the actually, I would say, really intellectual work that goes into looking after vulnerable dependents. And it's you have to be thinking in the future and the past and the present at like exactly the same time. You're constantly having to read them and empathizing. And but at that time, I was shocked by how much I felt that whenever I wasn't earning money and I wasn't working, that I was wasting my time. And that, I feel like that anyway. I always feel like I should be working because I've been, I've a very industrial psychology. But it felt very wrong, and that I was like, this isn't right. Like, it's not. This is a distortion of the value of care that's like baked into my mind and my cells. Yes, I get a lot of well-being from my work. I'm so lucky to do something I love and write, and I love, meeting people and so on. But a lot of it is about earning money so I can be part of the, consumer world and buy all the things that I feel like I should buy. And that was just a really stark and kind of, it was a good thing in a way, because it gave me a break from the marketplace and, a way to kind of have some objectivity and see, wow, I'm so influenced by like hyper-capitalism and consumerism, and it made me feel kind of embarrassed and ashamed about how much I had, almost looked down on caregivers or seen it as, even my mum worked, but I never saw her caregiving and her mothering in the same way as her. She's a painter. And now I look at women on the street, and I say women because it is mostly women, and I'm like, you are amazing. Like, you've probably been up all night, and you're recovering from birth and pregnancy, and you're just doing it. And I think it's a high art.
A high art and intellectual, yes, but also I don't know if we need to also package it in a way which makes it sound more productive or makes it sound more in line with what society values, in the sense of, we also know that if we were to die tomorrow in a month, the most important thing is being with the family, and all that hyper-consumerism really amounts to very little. And as in, I feel the same, right? So I stepped down from being CEO of Elvie because I was just so exhausted, and I wasn't doing anything that I enjoyed doing anymore. Even in my job, it wasn't the right job for me anymore. I was running a big company. And people still ask me now, like, oh, well, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm also spending more time with my kids. And then they're like, yeah, but what are you really doing? There's this sort of constant, like you said, it's the undervalue of it. But we all know, if you ask anybody, they'll say it's the most important thing in the world, right? Yeah. So that's also, we're living in conflict with what we say our values are, and then how we're choosing to live our lives.
It's a real like cognitive dissonance. So I think you see that with the kind of, there's like a hollow glorification of mothers and motherhood in our society. Women who don't have children are judged and found wanting, and we have this kind of Mother's Day, and there's this kind of quite shallow, I think, kind of glorification of the mother, but without the actual, the infrastructure we need, the the remuneration caregivers need, the social support, the adequate healthcare. It's kind of empty. It's like lip service, where actually, we're propping up the entire economy.
And it's sort of crazy though, isn't it, as well, that compared to even our parents or grandparents' generation, women are much more in the workforce, which is obviously a good thing because we have that right. But then you're saying we're also spending way more hours in the week with our kids. Like those two things what's giving in that equation, right? Is it just time for ourselves, or?
I think it definitely is. And I think, people are becoming parents at the moment at a time of like really extraordinary coalescence of social factors. Sociologists chart the rise of what they call intensive motherhood or intensive parenting, but they tend to say intensive motherhood from like the late 90s. It's now studied kind of across the Western world, the global north. And it seems to me that, in the 20th century, it was called like the century of the child. The way we treated children, certainly in Britain, was parlous. There was a lot of abuse and, a bad, now looking back, kind of, we treat and we think about children very differently, and it's for the better. We have like Bowlby and Winnicott around the Second World War who developed attachment theory, and you have Montessori and you have Piaget, you have these ideas of play, and it's kind of crescendoing through the 20th century to a point where there's this kind of obsession of child development, and it seems to morph instead of like if you go back to Bowlby, John Bowlby was the architect of attachment theory. So it's because of him that, if a child is ill in hospital, as a parent, you can be with the child. The child's not going to be like separated from you. Mm-hmm. It improved institutional care for kids, but it also gave us an understanding of attachment behavior and how there is this dance between baby and parent, normally mother, in the early years, which is a kind of bedrock for mental and emotional health and attachment relationships for life. So Bowlby was really clear in his writings and his books. He said, this is not a job for one person alone. Society needs to help the parents raise the children. And even in I think it was in the 70s or 80s, I quote him in Matrescence, he says something like, rich countries have forgotten what all cultures and societies know, which is that, the classic thing, it takes a village. So in the late 90s, you see this real like burst of intensive motherhood starting to happen. And then you've also got, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years, the gentle parenting, conscious parenting, respectful parenting coming in, of, knowing a lot more about mental health and the imperative to kind of be very attuned to your child, in comparison to, the discipline of which, isn't culturally acceptable now for good reasons. But the problem is that all of this stuff is landing, the literature shows, often on a mother. And unsurprisingly, intensive motherhood norms, which is, I kind of thought, this sounds like this maybe kind of like a middle class, like middle upper class type thing. But actually, the literature suggests that intensive parenting is now, cross class, cross cultures in the global north. It's very common.
But just a quick question, Lucy, because when you say intensive parenting, it has to me negative connotations, and I was imagining kind of helicopter parenting. But what you're describing is a natural evolution of the psychology, which is more child-centered and more, which is allowing the child to develop, right, in a more positive way. So it's actually sounding, do psychologists see it as a positive thing overall, or is it that we've taken this thing which could be positive and somehow warped it?
Exactly. That's how I would interpret it, and how kind of motherhood scholars would as well. Intensive mothering ideals is associated with, unsurprisingly, mothers experiencing stress, burnout, poor mental health. And I mean, like, what I have seen, and I wonder if it's the same with you, is that I see women around me who are crushed by the burdens of needing to parent like they don't have a job, and needing to do a job like they don't have children, and feeling that they're kind of failing at both. And I guess that the intensive motherhood idea is quite helpful, because it shows that these cultural norms are invented and confected, and that there's maybe a way to resist some of them. I mean, we all want our children to be like massively healthy, resilient, and happy, but do we have to?
Yeah, and when you talk about failing at parenthood, right, and this intensive parenting, again, I get the sense that right now I don't know what the scholars call it or so on, but the sense of, again, it's up to us, it's our responsibility much more than our parents thought about it. And it's almost like a project, right? If we put enough inputs, we're going to get the right outcomes, and, and it reflects on our success, which is kind of weird and messed up too, right?
Totally. And I think, yeah, and then you've got like kind of competition and the scarcity mindset, and this idea that there aren't, it feels quite unstable, like the job market's unstable, and then you've got people, there's like an anxiety about sending children to lots of different, making them, optimizing them in that kind of neoliberal, late capitalist way, so that they can survive in quite a atomized, individualized world, where you really have to, you can't, the bonds between us are so broken, I think, by neoliberalism, or eroded, that I can see that imperative to an anxiety to want your child to survive, and that causes competition.
Yeah, I think you're saying it in quite a nice way. I see it more like, I mean, yeah, because my kids are a bit older, right? So there's constant think, what school are they going to go to? And it's kind of down to us as parents to make sure they get into the right school, and then the way parents talk to each other about it. And actually, my son said to me, Mummy, it's so weird. Like, why are parents talking to each other about this? It's so weird. And I was like, he's so right. Like, this shouldn't even be a topic of, my view is also not just anxiety about them surviving in this world, but also it's a status thing, right? There's a real parents then treat their kids as part of their status, right? And their children need to therefore whatever tick whichever boxes and so on. And again, that's this idea that it's a reflection on us. And I think for me, it's constantly about trying to remember that they're their own people, and I'm there to help them. I think Michelle Obama talked about that once, actually, just saying, I just read it, it was a nice thing she said about parenthood is, you see your child going down that road, and all you want to do is you see these stones in the way, and they're going to you can see they're about to trip over, you just want to grab them. It just takes you 2 seconds, but you can't. You've just got to stay on the edge and let them fall over and be there. And especially when you talk about resilience, I think that's what I worry about with, I don't know if it's intensive parenting, but we're so, we wrap our children up so much in cotton wool if we can afford it, and if we've got the time, and just sort of so on. And, that does lead to the obvious question of how will they build resilience if there's not so much adversity?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm still so early on. I think, I guess one of the areas that I think about, I had quite a kind of, I guess, like authoritative or maybe authoritarian childhood, quite strict, quite very disciplined, and in a way I benefited from that, because it's given me like a lot of drive and discipline, and I had to do certain things a certain way, and I did rebel later and was like expelled from school and stuff, but there was like a sense of authority. And my dad has said to me, seeing kind of how we're raising the children, are they going to be able to like be under authority figures? There's like, because that sense of authority, I think, is quite interesting, in that I think sometimes I'm always worried that I'm too much of a pushover, or that authority thing or that discipline thing it's maybe gone so much the other direction, that it will be interesting. I mean, I guess we won't know what we've done wrong until it all comes out in the wash later on.
No, but again, I think it goes back to your point, regardless of life stage of the children and so on, that there's just constantly these contradictions and expectations on us as parents, right? It's not only we're supposed to work as if we don't have kids, or have kids as if we don't work, but we're also supposed to make sure that we create this positive environment in which they can have whatever emotions they want to have, but at the same time we then have to worry about whether or not they're going to be resilient and whatever. It's a crazy constant journey.
And also the thing that really bums me out and like partly made me write the book is that I feel like the maternal subjectivity in all of this is so lacking. So there are so many like feeling rules in this kind of psychological police state of motherhood.
What is that, Lucy? Psychological police?
So Susan Douglas has this, she's a sociologist, she calls it the psychological police state of motherhood, which I take to mean this idea that lots of feelings are outlawed. So you have to just be very one note and, any kind of shadowy feelings, any ambivalence is not really culturally acceptable. The child development books are filled with like the happiness imperative, that mothers must be happy all the time for their children. And I think it creates a depiction of a kind of robot or phantom or ghost that doesn't exist. One of the things that I've noticed since writing Matrescence, which was published in the UK about a year ago, so I've been written to by many hundreds of women since, and I've seen this pattern of women writing saying something like, I haven't been able to articulate how I feel. I haven't felt I've been allowed to feel the things that I feel. And I think that even though we're in, people would say, feminism's done its job. Like, of course it hasn't. It's going to be going on for like hundreds of years. And we thank the feminists who've done so much for us, and there's still so much to do. But even in 2024, I think, patriarchy has different faces. And at the moment, there is a like weirdly oppressive, suppressing force around this maternal ideal and these intensive motherhood ideals and stuff around, still about the maternal body and taboos around, failing at childbirth if it doesn't go how you want. Lots of pressure around breastfeeding, etc. That I think it's actually very oppressive at the moment for women.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, you've mentioned that before. Hiding. I was going to mention the word taboos. We all go through this, right? We feel constantly judged about how we decide to give birth. We're not given the right information. Breastfeeding. Oh, yeah, there's so many issues, as you said, which are still, they are being policed. But I think, I suppose switching to a more positive thing, like this weekend there was a Matrescence festival. Like, isn't that incredible?
Absolutely.
I see the same at LV too. There's a Femtech conference last week. Like, there's so much that's wrong, and I sit on panels, and sometimes people think I'm being too optimistic, but I'm like, I'm just so amazed by how much things have changed in the last 10 years, right? Even what we're talking about now, in 5 years' time, our kids are going to be like, well, that's so obvious. But when it's blindingly obvious, that's great, right? Because that means I think change can happen faster because you're hitting a raw nerve that is clearly, very widespread.
That's such a good way of putting it. And I think there is a lot of energy and momentum and movement at the moment. Like I said, there's like so much, there's much more, not enough, but a lot more research around, the parental brain, and it feels like a kind of mustering moment. The Matrescence Festival was amazing. It was put on by Lizzie Humber and Claire Tonti in Exeter, and it was honestly like extraordinary to be in a place for a couple of days with people, their babies, their children. People could make noises. They did this really clever thing where you could wear headphones so you could hear people, but the kids could also make noises. So it felt, I think children are so hidden in our society, and it was so nice that everyone was visible. And you're talking about all the taboo subjects, the maternal body, the horrific racial inequalities with maternal mortality, and like really serious, grave stuff, which needs a lot of more attention, like same-sex, mothering, so many different stories. And it was a real mix of dark and light, but there was a really strong thread of creativity and expression, and people with a real appetite to just talk about their experience of bringing a child into the world, which like is kind of a big deal.
It sounds so awesome. I can go talk to the team at LV. Like, we need to I don't know, hopefully we can maybe do one somewhere else and get together, and it just sounds brilliant.
That would be very cool.
Yeah, I mean, going back to one of the dark points, I did want to talk about postnatal depression and the mental health issue, because you sort of touched upon it a few times in our conversation. I know you've been quite open that you did have postnatal depression and you were put on medication.
One of the questions I was trying to answer with my research in Matrescence was how much perinatal mental illness is inevitable and how much could be prevented or prevented with a kind of better society. And of course, you can't really answer that. And but it felt to me that there's like a social impact of becoming a mother in our society, which is can be very detrimental to health and well-being. In terms, it can be a very lonely time. Like studies suggest that up to like 100% of new mothers feel lonely, and I think 30% of new parents feel like they have chronic loneliness. We know that loneliness is like really bad for us. We're social animals, and there are obviously different groups who are more vulnerable and susceptible. Like young mothers are, like immigrant or refugee mothers, same-sex couples, transgender parents, like that. Different groups are more susceptible to loneliness. But I felt that while I have a history of clinical depression and susceptibility to depression, and there is this enormous, huge hormonal thing that happens after the placenta is expelled. It's like the biggest hormonal drop in, like, I think, any experience of life. So, which mimics, it looks like depression. It's similar. So,
well, that's what I was going to ask, because there's biological basis as well, right?
Yeah.
Similar through menopause, and we're all more attuned to our menstrual cycles. We don't talk about the huge hormonal fluctuations that happen post-birth and menopause. And I also feel like that whole conversation, it's almost like we don't want to admit to it because it might make us play into that stereotype of, oh, women are hormonal, or they're emotional because of their hormones. But actually, there's reality to that sort of assumption too, right?
Well, I think that's probably driven a lot of the taboo as well, maybe in the last kind of 20, 30 years of, you having to hide any sign of, being a woman and your femininity or your, blood or anything to do with, that cycle. But yeah, there is a biological thing that happens, and that means that we need to get much better at treating postnatal mental illness, from depression to psychosis, OCD, anxiety. So we need like way more research and better treatment.
Do you mean sort of therapy, or do you mean medication? Because I also would have thought if we all know these are the changes that are happening to us, we might be a bit more gentle on ourselves and know what we're going through. In the same way we know when we get a period, we might be feeling a bit down, and that helps us manage it better, right?
Absolutely. So one of an interesting study for postnatal depression found that women who had the placebo, so didn't have the actual drug, had also really like improved rates of mental health. And the conclusion was that it was the social support of feeling kind of looked after and treated, which seemed to have this effect. So if you look at most cultures and societies across the world, they have a sense of the newborn mother, and they have a sense of matrescence, and that when a baby is born, a mother is born too. And so there are different, practices and ways of caring for the mother. In Mexico, they have like the closing of the bone ceremony. There's various confinement practices, and often they're to do with kind of 40 days, special nourishing meals, massages, drinks, and so on. And I mean, we don't really have that at all in the UK and the US, from what I can tell. And that feels like just totally crazy, that we expect women to become mothers and then just kind of be at home recovering from birth and pregnancy alone with a baby.
And all these changes that you don't even know what's causing them, right? Or that they're normal, and all that additional anxiety you're causing yourself, right?
Exactly. And that's, I think, why matrescence is a really like useful and helpful words and concepts and framework, because it illuminates this like really tender period, which can go on for years, and it gives us a way of saying, like, how's your matrescence, or like, how was your matrescence, or how, and patrescence as well. This is like a significant developmental stage that we have just neglected, and this word gives us a language to care better for each other. I guess postpartum is a way of saying it, but matrescence I think is cool because it's kind of like neutral. So it encompasses, everyone's matrescence is totally individual, but it's like it can mean your body, but it could also mean, for some people it'd be a very like spiritual experience, or an experience of like everything changing in a really interesting way.
No, I love it because it's like similar to adolescence, right? Nobody questions if you're going to go through it. Everybody knows that at a certain age, children will go through this period, and they know that there's going to be loads of changes, but it differs from child to child, and it's, as you said, a vulnerable period, but completely normal. So I think it's great, and I think on the mental health, as you're saying, if we can support women better, and if they can at least know that a lot of their feelings that they're having are okay, that would make a difference. I'm not saying it would solve everything. And actually, I was on a panel recently where they were talking about how there's been such a focus on the physical changes that happen to women during pregnancy and in the perinatal periods up to a year post-birth, but nothing on mental health, or we need to switch from the physical to the mental. And I was like, well, it's great that we're talking about mental health, but they're all so interconnected.
Yeah.
When you become a mum and you are so exhausted, like we cannot affect the insomnia, like the impact of insomnia on depression, on anxiety.
Totally.
Like it's a very, very clear relationship. Plus you've got birth trauma, plus you've got cracked nipples, you've got so much going on. This will all just come together, right? Which is why the matrescence works, because it's not pitting physical against mental health, which doesn't really make sense anyway, but just saying it's this development process, right? And that's what I love also about the way you write about it, with ecological perspective or whatever, bringing everything together. And it has to be holistic in that sense, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you put it so well.
Still lots to be done, but lots of positives to end on a positive note. Although, I do think when you, like now, Matrescence had incredible reviews and everybody's loving it, and it's leading to change already, right, in such a short period of time. But along the way, I can imagine you must have felt quite vulnerable because it's very personal and you're sharing a lot. So, the name of this podcast is Skin Like a Rhino, and it's about how sometimes we have to, whatever it is that we're facing, maybe people telling us we can't do something, or our own inner voice or whatever, and that sort of moments of how you, sort of share a story on how you manage to kind of grit your teeth and see through those dark moments.
Yeah. I think the experience of writing Matrescence, it definitely took a lot out of me. It was cathartic in many ways, but when I was sitting down to write it, which was often in like the woods or in our car or in like the Waitrose cafe or something, I felt like a really strong sense I shouldn't be writing what I was writing. And I had to really grit my teeth just to do the writing, and to say a lot of the stuff that I said in the book. This idea of this kind of Victorian idea of like a self-sacrificial woman who lives to serve others and never complains and is always happy, etc. And I felt that in me very strongly in motherhood in a different way. Like before I became a mother, I was quite, independent thinker, quite rebellious, quite able to just bat things off. But the role of mother for me felt incredibly judged and pressured and kind of constricted and like socially. I felt very socially aware of people's judgment and so on. So writing the book, I had to grit my teeth, and that did take a toll. And after the book came out last year, I was quite unwell. I got quite burnt out in the autumn, and I think it took a lot. But the thing that kept me going was that when I found the word matrescence and I felt that I could talk to other people about how I really felt, which was totally grateful for my baby, but also all of these other feelings, anger, fear, grief, loneliness, horror, terror, all these big feelings. Once I could talk to people, I just saw that so many women around me were struggling, and they were silenced by it. And they felt that it was their failing, their own personal failing, that they'd failed at birth, they'd failed at feeding, they'd failed at being the mother they were supposed to be. They were failing at their work, they were failing as a wife or girlfriend or partner, they were failing as a friend. And it just made me, if I couldn't access compassion for myself, which I find hard, but I could access it for them. And it makes me so angry that we expect people to become mothers in our society, and from the beginning they often feel like failures. And that just kept me going. I was just like, it's just not okay. Like, all these people I know, and I'd surveyed and interviewed people anonymously. I didn't know who had answered, and they came back with these really long, incredibly moving messages, similar to the ones I've got since Matrescence was published, of like real kind of bewilderment, confusion, pain, and stigma around it. And that's essentially what drove me to write the book, is just to tell the truth and to try and lift some of this stigma around the maternal experience.
Yeah, I'm smiling because it's funny. So on this, I spend a lot of time with more femtech entrepreneurs more than, say, writers like yourself. And what I have in common with the other femtech entrepreneurs is exactly what you've just described. It's all the same process, which is this kind of, fulfilling societal expectations of what it means to be a woman, or trying to as hard as possible. And then something happens which throws everything off. And a real sense of anger that women, other women are having unnecessary suffering like we are. And then the sense of needing to do something. So for me, obviously, it was starting LV, for you, it was writing Matrescence, and it being so much harder than you could ever imagine on every different level. The impact, not just on yourself, I'm sure on your family as well, but then you come out of it, and it's a wonderful privilege. I hope you feel the same too, of having known that we're part of something which is, one drop in the ocean, but we're all together. All of us women are changing things at a really fast speed. So I just want to say thank you, Lucy, for going through that pain, and I hope you get to relax. I know you've just launched in the US, but at some point get your energy levels back. And I'm very excited and happy to have met you.
Thank you. I really feel the same. It was such a pleasure to chat.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you very much. And anybody who hasn't read Matrescence, you must go and read it. And hopefully let's get thinking about the Matrescence Festival and metrics for measuring women's caring.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Thanks, Lucy.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Skin Like a Rhino. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to leave us a star rating. Your feedback means the world to us and helps others discover the podcast. Until next time.